Is it just me, or is it impossible to line up animals in the way they evolved?
It's quite easy to do, actually. Scientists have been doing it for hundreds of years, even Christian scientists. And me and a couple dozen volunteers built a massive database just for that purpose, and I did a 50-part video series explaining some of the details about that, things that would be hard to learn otherwise unless you're studying both paleontology and anthropology. I mean, classifying life forms according to a taxonomic system might be hard for Jane to do, but that's only because she doesn't have a clue, and she evidently doesn't want one either.
What's wrong, Jane?
I had the weirdest experience last night.
I really don't want to hear the intimate details about your private life.
Was your dog wearing lipstick again?
Yes, but that's not the point. I went to my friend Carrie's house.
Oh, that is weird.
That doesn't sound weird to me. I know Carrie herself can be a bit intense at times, but I imagine Jane would get along quite nicely with Carrie's mom.
No, see, that's not the part. It's that she's living in my house.
Does your mom know?
No.
Can you imagine having Carrie secretly living in your attic, or under the stairs, or maybe in that secret room you've never been to on the other side of the mirror?
I mean, her house looks just like mine. Our doors are alike.
Maybe it's a parallel universe and Carrie's your alternate.
I doubt that, because Carrie knows how to make things happen when she puts her mind to it. Instead, if it is an alternate universe, then I think Jane has an alternate mom with buttons sewn onto her face where her eyes should be.
Maybe. And you know what? I went inside and I went into the living room, and it's the exact same shape and size as mine. Even the stairs are in the exact same place. And the stairs were going up in exactly the same way.
Let me guess. If there was one long staircase just going up, was there another even longer coming down? And one going nowhere just for show?
At the top was a hallway, and there were 2 bedrooms straight ahead.
You didn't go in, did you?
Jessica has gone beyond the door.
And behind the infamous green door, she was made to perform the most bizarre
Yes. And Carrie's room was to the right, with her bed under the exact same window.
And let me guess, on top of the bed was a bear.
No, the bear was in her brother's room, on top of his bed.
It was such a freaky experience.
Jane, it's because you live in tract housing.
Huh?
They only make a few different house plans that they repeat throughout the whole neighborhood.
Okay. I never knew that.
Yeah, it reminds me of homologous structures.
Of course, me too. What are you talking about?
Notice that John wants to assert or assume that the consistency we see in homology is not an indication of evolution, that it is only coincidental, that all living things follow this pattern of derived traits. Believers think there's no such thing as coincidence, except when they're trying to pretend that all this evidence of evolution doesn't really mean anything. They want us to think that that is just a coincidence.
Sorry, I was just studying it in our textbook. So, what's the term homo mean?
Homos is Greek for same.
Right, and logos means relation. So homologous means having the same relation.
And that was in our textbook?
Yeah, no, it says right here in the biology book. Gracias.
De nada.
Here. Homologous structures are structures that share a common ancestry. That is, a similar structure in 2 organisms can be found in the common ancestor of the organisms.
Not sure I got all that.
Which part?
Well, all of it.
Okay, look at the diagram.
So they say the penguin, alligator, bat, and human all evolved from a common vertebrate ancestor because they have similar bones in their forelimbs.
That's quite a family.
Remember that John is a young Earth creationist, so he has to imagine that everything was poofed out of nothing, literally by magic, just a little while ago, because he imagines himself and the rest of humanity to be the reason the universe exists. His perspective has no depth, so he pretends that one animal gave birth to a penguin, an alligator, a bat, and a human, all at once in the same litter, because he neither has nor wants any understanding of evolution, much less the taxonomy or fossils that support it. But just to clarify, penguins are birds, of course, and birds are a subset of dinosaurs, themselves a subset of archosaurs, just like crocodilians are. So there was a time, way back in the Triassic period, roughly 240 million years ago, when the ancestor of crocodilians and the ancestors of birds Both looked superficially lizard-like shortly after they branched off from the line that led to actual lizards. So this common ancestor of today's ducks and crocodilians is your so-called crocoduck. But if you go back even further into the Carboniferous period, some 318 million years ago, the ancestors of reptiles and the ancestors of mammals both looked vaguely lizard-like, because that's the most generalized shape that an amniote can have. There are differences, of course, between each other and from lizards, but they're internal, distinguishing diapsid reptiles from synapsids, which is what we are. There is a surprisingly long and robust lineage of transitional intermediates in the synapsid line, not just single species, but multiple families of them, especially in the Permian period, but continuing on through the entire Mesozoic era, where what once looked like reptiles continue to change incrementally into increasingly mammalian forms and eventually into true mammals. Then, very near the end of the Mesozoic era of the dinosaurs, the ancestors of bats and the ancestors of primates, again, look very much like each other in the most generalized shape that a mammal can have, which is similar to that of a shrew. And both of these groups went into the trees. And one set became gliders and flyers, eventually, and then the other group improved the dexterity of their hands, becoming monkeys and then apes and then people. That is the common ancestry of penguins, alligators, bats, and humans. We determine all of this not just from the homology of the bones, but from myriad fossil forms that collectively illustrate why those bones are homologous, as well as genetic evidence confirming that that really is the evidence that it seems to be.
So, imagine the job evolutionists have.
What is an evolutionist? That is anyone of any religion or no religion, anyone and everyone who is not a creationist, who does not deny scientific realities in favor of a literal interpretation of mythical scriptures. The word evolutionist is an attempt at the fallacy of false equivalence, where the believer tries to pretend as if science is somehow just another faith-based belief system, as if a lack of faith in religion somehow counts as religious faith. Another word that these fundies misuse is creature, which is a fallacious question-begging presupposition that every animal was created by magic rather than having evolved.
They must take the entire animal kingdom and try to determine which creatures evolved from others.
That's actually pretty easy to do, and there are a few ways to do it. First was taxonomy, of course, beginning in 1735. That's not really that hard. It's just like playing a grown-up version of the old Sesame Street game of one of these things is not like the others, wherein you determine which differences are superficial versus which ones are fundamental. And then a century or so later came the integration with the fossil record, providing quite a few transitions between those previously and sometimes erroneously established taxonomic groups like we just talked about. And now, another century after that, we have genomic sequence comparisons, allowing us to verify phylogenies for every lineage that is still alive, like this study showing the divergence of all modern placental mammals around the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction. So it's not at all the mystery that creationists try and make it out to be. They only want it to seem mysterious because they themselves are mystified by their own mysticism.
Okay, so they look for these homologous structures to show an evolutionary relationship.
You got it. And they would look convincing, but look at the definition of homologous.
Homologous structures are structures that share a common ancestry.
Sometimes we see structures with similar functions in creatures that don't come from a supposed common ancestor.
Got an example?
I do. A human and a squid eye.
What?
Both humans and squid have a lens that projects an image onto a retina. The problem is that evolutionary theory holds that the closest ancestor to both didn't have eyes, but only a patch of light-sensitive skin cells. That means that a very similar eye had to evolve twice, completely independent from each other.
Notice how John makes it sound like humans and squids share this feature that we shouldn't have in common, like finding a Chevy V8 engine mounted inside a Volkswagen Beetle, because he wants you to think of animals as being like created machines with interchangeable parts, like when we used to be able to swap out headlights from a Ford and a Chevy. But what he does not want you to realize is the homology, that humans have the same basic type of eye as all other mammals, which is a specific modification of the basic eye structure that we share with all other vertebrates. That's homology. And meanwhile, the squid is not a species. They're not all one genus either, nor a family, nor even an order. They're a taxonomic superorder, with hundreds of species alive today and myriad more that have gone before. I wonder if creationists would call them all the same kind. Anyway, The squid superorder is in the same clade of cephalopods as another superorder, Octopodoforms, which include a few hundred species of the octopus. So are squids and octopuds the same kind? And creationists cannot say definitively, or rather they won't. They would rather pretend that the octopus is an extraterrestrial alien, despite all of its obvious relation to the squid. Anyway, both squids and octopuds share the same sort of eyes as each other, but their eyes are different from ours. There are only so many different ways you can make an eye. For example, there are eye spots that are like a jellyfish. Did you know that jellyfish are surrounded by a ring of eyes? They don't have brains or organs of any kind, but they have these relatively simple photoreceptors that qualify as eyes. And there are also different sets of compound eyes that each represent their own lineage and that do not function as well as our eyes do. Look at horseshoe crabs, for example. They're covered in eyes. They've got 5 eyes on the tops of their heads and a few more underneath them too, and they've even got a number of simple eyes running down their tails, as if that makes sense. And the best quality eyes they have are these prominent compound eyes that don't really work that well at all. So why would an intelligent designer come up with all of these different types of eyes, especially when these so-called designs don't work very well? And the most advanced form of eyes is called camera eyes, because coincidentally we built cameras that work like our eyes, or more specifically they work like cephalopod eyes, because their eyes focus by moving the position of the lens like a camera does, whereas vertebrate eyes focus by changing the shape of the lens. And our lens is on the outside of their eye, and cephalopods have theirs fully internal. Another difference is that cephalopods are all colorblind because they don't have the interior structures that we do for determining color. Although they have a different type of pupil than we do, and that might be used as a workaround to perceive different, or as a different means of perceiving color. There is, however, one way in which cephalopod eyes are better than ours. We have blood veins covering our retina, and this gives us a blind spot in our vision, which we compensate for with tiny, continuous micro-movements that we don't even notice it. Cephalopod eyes have their veins on the other side of the retina, right where an intelligent designer would have put them. But John wants to pretend as if human eyes are different from those of all other vertebrates, as if the squid has different eyes from all other cephalopods, and that they and we were built with the same interchangeable parts, as if squids and people were both manufactured in Detroit and the rest of the animal kingdom are foreign imports or something.
They call this convergent evolution and believe that the same process of random mutations happening over millions of years built similar structures.
No way! An eye's so amazing, it seems impossible that it could have evolved in the first place.
That's what Darwin said too. To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus at different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. But, he continued, saying that reason tells me that if numerous gradations from a simple and imperfect eye to one complex and perfect can be shown to exist, each grade being useful to its possessor, as is certainly the case, if further the eye ever varies and the variations be inherited, as is likewise certainly the case, and if such variations should be useful to any animal under the changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though insuperable to our imagination, should not be considered as subversive to the theory. How a nerve comes to be sensitive to light hardly concerns us more than how life originated, but I may remark that as some of the lowest organisms in which nerves cannot be detected are capable of perceiving light, it does not seem impossible that certain sensitive elements in their sarcode should become aggregated and developed into nerves endowed with this special sensibility. Darwin explained this pretty well for his time, and other biologists have since explored this deeper and compounded quite a lot more evidence to back up what he said.
But now they believe it happened twice?
No, it happened more times than that, with several fundamentally different types of eyes and several successive stages of development too. In fact, the entire evolution of the eye can be seen just in mollusks, which includes cephalopods. There are several distinct eye types showing different levels of complexity, from a pit or cup eyes of gastropods to the pinhole eyes of the nautilus to the lensed eyes of the squid and octopus. giving us examples of each sequential stage of evolution to their best developed eyes yet.
Yep, that would be impossible. Times 2.
Remember that John believes in a God, and that gods are impossible by definition, because gods are defined by their miraculous nature. Miracles share essentially the same definition as magic, being the evocation of supernatural forces or entities to control or forecast natural events in ways that are inexplicable by science because they defy the laws of physics. Not just that our current physics can't explain them, but that whatever that is, in order to qualify as a miracle, has to defy the laws of physics of what physics can explain. And whatever defies the laws of physics is at least technically, physically impossible by definition, and thus gods are impossible by extension. In order to say whether something is possible, there must be some precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon indicating that such possibility exists. We don't have that for any god, but we do have that for evolution, and even the evolution of the eye specifically. Darwin already explained it 160 years ago, and if you look up the evolution of the eye on YouTube, you'll see dozens of illustrative lessons where subsequent biologists have added more information to that from fossils and genetics and such that Darwin couldn't have known about.
Are there other examples of similar looking organs that don't fit evolutionary trees?
Oh yeah, lots.
No, there is not any, not even the one John suggested.
Think about flight. Man, with all his intelligence, just figured out how to fly less than 200 years ago. But flight supposedly evolved at least 4 different times. Birds, insects, mammals, like bats, and reptilian flight, like pterodactyls.
Except that we know that it's not impossible. It is instead probable and inevitable.
Now that makes it 4 times impossible.
And it seems to have happened 5 times, not just 4. In the previous episode of the series, I mentioned how easy it was for insects, being so small and at the mercy of the wind already, but the vertebrates went about it differently. Now first, after insects came pterosaurs, and their predecessors were evidently lightweight arboreal jumpers, leading to the reptilian version of a flying squirrel with a stretchable membrane between the front and hind limbs. Bats were similar, except for pushing themselves backward off of trees to glide. And in either case, the next adaptation was longer arms and fingers on a small enough animal that it would make a difference initially. The first pterosaurs were tiny, yet relatively heavy for their size, and clumsy, not very capable flyers at all. But 100 million years of practice and refinement via natural selection over little tweaks and subtle improvements here and there produced the most lightweight and competent aerodynamics ever, such that some of these things were as tall as a giraffe with the wingspan of a fighter plane, yet they only weighed as much as I do. And after pterosaurs came birds, of course, a lineage of dinosaurs who had originally developed very tiny wings for sexual displays and to better insulate a larger clutch of eggs. But again, the smaller ones noted aerodynamic advantages, that even tiny wings would help them defy gravity, running up steep angles. Then, as with bats and pterosaurs, the ancestors of birds themselves began gliding out of treetops, which provided selective pressure for larger wings until they were capable of powered flight. So that's 4 times that flight evolved, but there might be a 5th if we consider Scansoriopterids. They were another lineage of Paravian dinosaurs that had feathers but didn't use their feathers for flight. Instead, they did the same thing as the bats and pterosaurs did. They grew a gliding membrane and then long fingers to better control the wing. So a feathered dinosaur with something like a bat's wing. Quite unexpected, and again, not something we should expect of an intelligent designer.
So, going back to the human and squid eye, would they be called homologous structures since they look similar?
Nope. When similar structures are found on creatures that aren't considered closely related, they are called convergent.
So they evolved completely independent from each other?
Yeah. Evolution supposedly built the same basic organ more than one time, but it sounds more like a rescuing device, like a make-believe story than a scientific concept.
This from the guy whose job, as an actor, if we can call him that, is rescuing a make-believe story, a fairy tale about magic spells and talking animals and cursed fruit, and all of it obviously metaphorical, literally just a fable with a moral, but without any connection to, nor interest in, nor respect for science whatsoever.
So how do you know the difference between when similar structures are homologous and when they're analogous?
I'm not sure.
Let me help you with that then. The earliest fish in the fossil record didn't have the twin fluked tails that are so common on fish today. Instead, the first forms were more like the tails of a tadpole, with just a dorsal fin running the length of the body. But in later geologic periods, we see that fin distorting into a familiar fluke shape. Then bony fish separated from cartilaginous fish, and both lineages continued developing this same shape because it is the most efficient for the type of swimming they do. And then many millions of years later, ichthyosaurs came along and did the same thing. They started out looking like what you would get if you made a seal out of a reptile. Then, as they evolved, we see the vertebrae of the tail bending downward, making the bottom fluke, as a fin of skin and cartilage made up the fluke above it, so that they ended up looking like what you would get if you built a dolphin out of a reptile. And then, soon after ichthyosaurs went extinct, a line of lizards called mosasaurs covered that same classic tune, with the largest and most recent of them, again, developing that same sort of crescent fluke the same way as done before, but on lineages that we can see evolved separately and in different time periods. And that's not all. Back in the Mesozoic era, there was even a lineage of sea-going crocodile that did the same thing, developing a crescent in the same way that all those other lineages did before. But we're still not done, because when cetaceans returned to the sea, they did the same thing too. During the development of mammals from things that we used to think of as reptiles, there was a shift in the way that they ran from a slither to a gallop, so that the spine became more adept at up and down undulation rather than winding side to side. So whales developed those same tails, albeit sideways, again as a natural consequence of needing the most efficient shape to do the job. And we're still not done, because one more lineage did that too. When Sirenians returned to the sea, they too relied on their tails for propulsion. Now, if you look at a modern manatee, you'll see a tail that is functional for slow-moving animals, though it has not been optimized. However, one lineage of Sirenian has completed that development, and we see that the dugong has that classic shape in their tails too. It's just that if you're a large, heavy animal that spends your time in the ocean and swims with your tail, then your descendants are going to develop this type of shape in their flukes eventually. That makes a lot more sense than pretending that an intelligent designer kept conjuring these intermittent stages that weren't good enough for his resume because they couldn't do what they do nearly as well in their earlier forms.
It says here, homologous structures are structures that share a common ancestry. But how can anyone be sure that structures actually shared a common ancestry?
Because, as I already said, there are many other facts to take into account. For example, look at beaks. Turtles have beaks, and some dinosaurs had beaks. Pterosaurs had beaks too, and even some therapsids had beaks. And we know that the earliest forms of all of these things had, well, let's call them lips instead, as well as teeth. Having a beak isn't enough to make a bird into a turtle or a pterosaur, but you've got to admit that all the birds and turtles alive today have beaks and no teeth, having inherited those traits from earlier ancestors in each lineage, wherein the toothy birds and turtles of way back when are no more. The same goes for other things too. Hooves, for example, are essentially fingernails that grew too thick, covering the end of the toe. And this has happened a few times, including one species of marsupial and even a species of terrestrial crocodilian. Imagine a crocodile with hooves. But it also happened in a particular group of placental mammals in such a way that it was inherited by artiodactyls and perissodactyls that persist to this day.
When similarities fit evolution, there are homologous structures. But when they don't fit, they claim the structure evolved more than once?
Wow, that's circular reasoning.
No, it isn't. But it's funny to hear this from the girl who says that the Bible is infallible because it is the Word of God, and the only way we know that is if we assume that what the Bible says is infallible because we believe it is the Word of God.
How so?
Their evolutionary theory decides what is homologous, and then they say homologous structures prove evolution.
Hey, that's right. That's really messed up.
No, as usual, John and Jane got it all wrong. Understand that a scientific theory isn't just some wild guess or empty speculation like religion is. A scientific theory is a body of knowledge, including all facts, natural laws, and associated hypotheses that explain a given phenomenon. So it is not the circular argument that Jane makes it out to be, because we have many different lines of evidence, all pointing the same way and corroborating each other. Homology is just one of those lines of evidence.
So how do creationists explain similar structures?
Simple. They share the same master designer, God. God built similarly designed features into his creatures, making sure each feature was precisely tailored to fit that creature's systems. It's like airplanes, skateboards, cars, and motorcycles. They all need wheels and tires, but designers made them different to tailor them to each vehicle's unique specifications. It's also like the similarities between yours and Carrie's house. They were designed by the same architect for the same purpose.
So when houses look the same, it's because they were designed for the same purpose by the same architect. And when houses look different, it's because they were designed for the same purpose, but by different architects. And likewise, when animals look similar or have similar features, like a velociraptor and a bird, then it's just coincidence because they had the same designer. But when animals look entirely different, like a bat and a pterosaur and a dragonfly, that's because they were adapted to the same purpose, but by the same designer again?
Wow, that's circular reasoning.
Hey, that's right. That's really messed up.
And when vehicles look the same or have certain similarities, it's because they had the same designer. But when vehicles look different, it's because they had different designers. But John and Jane will not apply the same reasoning to animals. They're not going to allow that there could be different designers. And it doesn't matter whether animals look the same or completely different. They're never going to admit that it's really because they're closely or distantly related. Instead, they're always going to say that the reason they're different or similar is because they had the same designer, even when there evidently was no designer and could not possibly have been one. But if you're going to say that all mammals look the same because they have the same designer, then how do you explain mantis shrimp? That doesn't look like anything like them. How come no one acknowledges the very different things that were obviously designed by the devil? I'm kidding, of course. I don't believe in devils. But seriously, if there had been a designer, then we should occasionally see creatures in real life like we always see in every myth or movie whenever the author made up monsters. Every single example of fictional beasties always violates taxonomy, and they always have ever since the ancient Greeks started mixing parts and adding dinosaur wings to mammals. Everything that has ever lived fits into an evolutionary taxonomy in a way that no created thing ever does, because that's the nature of created kinds. If there was a God, and he reportedly has the ability to make things from scratch, to redesign skeletons, adding extra limbs, or mixing features borrowed from other creations, or giving mammal traits to insects, rather than always only ever slightly modifying already existing previous forms that do not represent his best work, if this sort of miraculous creative designer existed, then it wouldn't be that vertebrates have one type of wing and insects have another. If we were all magically conjured by the same mystical manufacturer, then he could swap features in a way that only a designer could do, but that evolution could not allow. But we never see this in reality, and the reason we don't is not because God couldn't do it, but because evolution couldn't do it.
That sounds like Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6. You alone are the Lord. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts, the earth and everything on it, the seas and all that is in them. And you preserve them all. The host of heaven worships you.
That's not entirely accurate.
So similar structures point back to a creative and intelligent God, not to the circular reasoning or random coincidences of evolution.
Everything that guy just said is bullshit.
Kind of makes you think, doesn't it?
It makes me think that whoever wrote the script knows that their own position is just circular reasoning and random coincidences, and that they wrote all of this projection into the script to distract the viewer, hoping you wouldn't notice that they're accusing the unbelievers of the very thing that believers and believers alone are guilty of. Oh, but we did notice that, didn't we?